What does heroism mean? Why does it figure into the denial of death? And how does it relate to this mitigation of our anxiety?
Yeah, no, again, very awesome. So basically, what Becker does is at the very beginning of the denial of death, he says, "Look, in the birth and death of meaning, I talked about self-esteem, and he starts off the denial of death with a quote by William James, which is that basically life is just a theater for heroism." And he what he says is, look, when one way to think about self-esteem is that we're striving for heroic transcendence. The way I like to talk about it, Robinson, is I'm like, well, when we think about heroism, and I'm getting this from Rollo May's book, The Cry for Myth. He's an existential therapist. And Rollo May, based on Becker, says the same thing, that we're striving for heroic transcendence. Right now, sometimes that means heroic with a capital H. I want to be like General MacArthur and win a war. Or I want to be like Einstein and come up with the theory of relativity, or I want to be an Olympic athlete. And we're quite familiar with that kind of heroism. And hopefully it's fairly obvious how that has death-denying qualities, because basically in mythological terms, a hero is kind of a larger-than-life individual who is often able, by virtue of their capacities, to forestall death, even if not permanently. But then there's just another kind of heroism, and I call that heroic with a little h. And for me, that would consist of just making the best of the circumstances that you find yourself in your life. And so from that perspective, you might be walking around outside and notice that somebody who's, let's say, visually impaired is about to walk into traffic. And so you go out of your way to help that individual not get run over. Well, that also has a heroic dimension. And what we know empirically is that when we perceive that what we're doing has any kind of tinge of heroic qualities, it really does serve to enhance meaning and value.
Going back to this idea of the tyranny of merit, then, heroism with a capital H in the contemporary worldview might be something like striving to achieve these values of fame, wealth, and so on, which one takes on almost as a mission. But then I think heroism with a lowercase h is more of a timeless, worldview agnostic sort of feature of life that might also be healthier for
Oh
achieving
yeah,
one's
so
self-esteem.
no, Robinson, right? I love how you put that because there are some folks now that dabble in a concept and they call it existential appreciation, and they point out that the people that find life most meaningful are not necessarily striving for world dominance in the form of excellence, so much as they are just profoundly appreciative of whatever it is that they happen to be doing. So when I said earlier that Becker puts a lot of stock on self-esteem, and so do I, but more recently, folks in positive psychology, they look at things a little bit differently, but I do think in ways that might ultimately be happier and healthier. And so there's a concept in clinical psychology these days called cosmic insignificance, that just when you realize that you're an inconsequential speck of respiring dust born in a time and place not of your choosing, here for a tiny amount of time before you're summarily obliterated. Well, some people find that incredibly demoralizing. And yet other people find it tremendously uplifting. And it turns out that what appears to mediate that difference is whether you perceive yourself as connected to everything and everyone around you. And so the Otto Rank, who was one of Freud's dudes that Becker writes about in The Denial of Death, in one of his books, Truth and Reality, he says that human beings are, I forget what he called us, something like that word. I forget the phrase, but he points out that we're all related to the first form of life, and that basically we're descended from that first form of life. That makes us related to everything that has ever existed, everything that exists now, everything that ever will exist. And their point is there is something quite comforting and uplifting about just being part of the intricate web of life, as it were. And I'm being long-winded here, Robinson, but I guess what I'm pointing out is that appears to be another viable vehicle towards psychological equanimity. I don't need to be the best at everything that I do. I can appreciate whatever it is that I happen to be doing. And in positive psychology lingo, they talk about like a tripod of interrelated affectations. That they describe it in terms of awe, humility, and gratitude. So they're just saying, again, a lot of these concepts are intertwined with the way the Kierkegaards and the Tillot's and the Bubers of the world see it theologically. It's just that at our best, we sometimes just find it awesome to be alive. And we don't need anything in particular to have happened in order to appreciate that in joyous exuberance, the fact that we're here. And according to the positive psychology types, when you're in a state of awe, it also makes us humble, not self-deprecating, but just that we recognize our position relative to the rest of the universe. When we're in a state of awe and in a state of humility, it makes us more saliently aware of the fact that our lives are probably better than most, or at least the way I talk about it with the students. I'm like, hey, if you slept in a bed last night and had breakfast today, you should be extraordinarily grateful. So back to the original point, yeah, I do think there are different routes to heroic transcendence. I think they're all vehicles to acquire a sense of meaning and value. And this is not to denigrate self-esteem, but I do argue these days that it's time to consider broadening the palette of options that can be provided for people in order to satisfy what are essentially the same basic foundational psychological needs for meaning and value.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the difficulty isn't in just understanding that achieving fame and fortune won't make us happy, but that integrating into a web of life will, but deeply ingraining it in one's psyche and displacing the quite deeply entrenched tyranny of merit. That's the real difficult part. But relating importantly, I think, to this notion of heroism is another terminological peculiarity maybe of Becker. I don't know if it's used elsewhere, if it's a term of art in psychoanalysis, but what is his idea of a causa sui project? What is a causa sui? He talks about that a great deal.
Yeah, so this is to my discredit that I should know what that term means in Latin, but it really is related to this drive for heroism. And so basically what he's arguing is that whether we're aware of it or not, we all unconsciously have some idea of what it is that we're doing as individuals to strive for immortality. So what Becker says is that Freud's immortality project was to be known as the discoverer of psychoanalysis. You might say that Bill Gates's immortality project would be to be the discoverer of Microsoft, or maybe in his later days to have been associated with encouraging super wealthy people to give some of their money back. All right, but it might be that your immortality project is more at least superficially modest. Johnny Appleseed wanted to leave the country with apple trees. He didn't want to write his name on any of the trees, but he just wanted to do something that would have consequences thereafter. And so I think that's in general what the term refers to.
Okay, so what makes something an immortality project is that it leads to your being remembered, and so you live on either in memory or some other structure.
Yeah, absolutely. So this would be generally what Becker refers to as symbolic immortality, which he dates back to the ancient Greeks, who pointed out that you may not live forever, but that does not in any way diminish your desire to have some vestige of your existence persist nonetheless. You know, maybe having kids, making a boatload of money, doing a podcast, just anything that will preserve a vestige of our respective existences.
And to tie everything back together, it's this pursuit of the immortality project that we engage in to mitigate the anxiety of death. Okay. And there's now room to get into all sorts of different specifics. One thing that comes to mind is talking about different sorts of immortality projects. Did Becker have any particular views on the immortality projects of artists, writers, painters, these sorts of people? Were they particularly interesting immortality projects for him?
Yes, for him they were, Robinson. So Becker had a controversial take on a lot of matters. One is that he was devoutly religious himself. And so at the end of the denial of death, he makes a plea for religious worldviews broadly defined as being potentially more conducive to fostering psychological well-being than secular ones. And his view, and the way he put it in the book, is that secular is always grounded to a certain degree in physical reality, and any claim to perpetuity on that level is apt to be dashed historically. So you can say that America's great, we're going to be here forever, but realistically, every country comes and goes. But if you have a worldview based on an ethereal and not tangible, can't be put into words, transcendent entity, that being God, well, then you are less likely to have your cosmic view of the universe undermined by physical reality. So that's one aspect, is that Becker was a big fan of religious worldviews, while at the same time being painfully and poignantly aware of the dangers of religious views. So he quotes Paul Tillich, who says, look, on the one hand, religion at its best, it grounds us as no other stance towards life is capable of. And yet, on the other hand, we get into trouble when we take our symbols too literally, to the point where we've got to kill someone who doesn't share them. All right, so that's the religious end of things. But then to get back to your question, he saw creativity broadly defined, using the artist as the prototype, as one of the most potentially constructive forms of death transcendence. And what he says is that what an artist does is to use their artwork. That becomes their immortality project. That they literally take their existential concerns. Do you know Suzanne Langer's work? You may be too young, the American philosopher. She talked about, this is of yesteryear. But anyway, she talked about art she defines art as an objectification of subjectivity. It's not just an expression of feeling so much as, for Langer, she defined feeling very broadly as any sensation, whether we're aware of it or not. But she argued that art is a way that we can express ourselves, we could express our feelings that cannot be expressed in words. And Becker jumps on that, and he says, what the artist does at their best, it is to transform existential anxieties into some kind of physical manifestation that, according to Otto Rank in his book Art and Artist, serves a social function when the people who partake of the art are affected by it, not necessarily in the same way that the artist is or how the artist intended, but Becker's argument is that art is a prototype for humanity at its best, because it allows for creative individual expression that also has a pro-social dimension. And that is that the artist is always hoping to engage fellow humans in ways that, at best, are existentially uplifting for both parties.
I don't know if this is existentially uplifting, but as I hear you describe this transference, and since we're talking about psychoanalysis, I don't mean transference in a psychoanalytic sense, but of existential dread into artwork. I think of Munch and the Scream, Angst, all of these paintings, and how they certainly serve a social function. Like I said, I don't think that they're uplifting, but they were a very successful immortality project for Munch.
No, awesome. And for me, I'm not, I love art, but I have no background. But the Van Gogh's work is, I think, maybe for me, a more uplifting expression of someone clearly in varying degrees of angst. But good point.
Mm-hmm. One danger of religious views that you alluded to, but that we haven't touched on yet, but is particularly salient for me because I just did an episode on the world history of genocide, is that since these worldviews are so important to our self-esteem and our immortality projects, when they are threatened by other worldviews that suggest that ours might not be the correct one, this historically results in a great deal of violence. Like, look at things like genocides, like the Crusades, for instance, where, of course, there are financial motives, but they're also inherently religious.
That's right. And as Becker points out, it sometimes persists for centuries. I guess the conflict in Yugoslavia a few decades ago went back to the 1200s in terms of ongoing competition between competing worldviews.